Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. I'm your host, Douglas Gabriel. I'm here today with Michael McKibben, and we are going to rip up grand juries. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hi, Douglas. Ready to go.
Well, we had a long discussion, many months before about Mueller, and the way that Mueller, when he was in the Department of Justice as a Deputy Attorney General in California twice, he messed with the rules of evidence for federal cases, which specifically bleeds over into grand juries because they use them there.
Did you mean Deputy U.S. Attorney?
Yes, what did I say?
You said Attorney General.
Oh, no, not Attorney General, Deputy Attorney. He worked in the Department of Justice. There should be names for these people, but we'll just call them the names that they have. But basically, why would a man who had his legal stature and making that much money keep going back into government work making next to nothing? Well, that's because when he was in California twice, he messed with the rules of evidence and what can be put in as evidence and what can be allowed, what can't be allowed, and particularly in relationship to federal cases, which then affected what you have found out in your recent research, the Oklahoma bombing, but also Ruby Ridge, Waco, 9/11, and more specifically, the recent Mueller special counsel investigation ignored more evidence than they looked at. They ignored the exculpatory evidence that would have proven that Trump was innocent. And it's not even in their report, no reference to any of the guilty people. So you would say, well, how could this happen? Normally, when we see something that crazy, we assume there must be a law that allows it. Now, I hate grand juries. They're a star chamber that should have ended when star chambers ended hundreds of years ago because they're nothing but rigged. But what Michael McKibben has found out is the specific evidence in relationship to the Oklahoma bombing case that shows that there's legal shenanigans going on, legal trickery going on with everything with Mueller. And remember, Mueller was with Comey, and they worked these deals out long in advance of 9/11 when they'd need them, or other cases when they'd need them. So they come in a revolving door, they get into these positions, they change the laws, they change regulations, they change administrative policies. No one knows about it. They take advantage of it. And this is exactly what happened with Mueller's special counsel investigation. So tell us how it is that you looked at the case of the Oklahoma bombing scenario at grand jury indictment and what it is that you found there, Michael.
Yeah, that just popped out of an investigation into a law that Mueller cited in his report on page 177, paragraph 3, which was a case called U.S. v. Williams. And in that case, it was a Supreme Court opinion that permitted federal prosecutors to withhold exculpatory evidence whenever they wanted to, and it would not invalidate the action of the grand jury. And when we first read that, we thought, well, no way that can be the case. And specifically, the phrase popped out like a sore thumb. It said, the actions of the grand jury belong to no branch of government and the people. And I thought, what? So we've got a grand jury action which exists within the United States that belongs to no branch of government and the people. So here we've got Mueller, who has been acting as if he is a monarch, is actually citing a case in which he says the courts allow him to act on that basis, and he's not accountable to essentially anybody. So that's how we got into this, and what you're saying about the Oklahoma City bombing was a spin out of this particular case as we began looking at how is it possible that the Supreme Court would ever come to a decision that would allow an innocent person to be indicted when the evidence of their innocence had been withheld by the special prosecutor. I mean, that should just not happen. Any reasonable person would agree. And as we learned in disassembling this case, taking it from the district court to the appeals court to the Supreme Court and then back to the district court, where, by the way, the record disappeared after that. We started seeing the fact that no judge during this process, all the way up to the Supreme Court, agreed that it was possible to withhold evidence. The district court threw the case out when it was discovered that the special counsel had withheld evidence in the case. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with the district court judge and threw it out again. And then we had 4 U.S. attorneys and a Solicitor General of the U.S. take the case to the Supreme Court, where they got the Supreme Court to flip the decision and say that it was possible. And that was the case that Mueller cited as his excuse for withholding evidence in the Trump-Russia investigation, which is outrageous. Come on.
It's totally outrageous. Because, just as you said, it makes him a monarch. It makes him independent of the government and of we the people, incorrect. Right. Even the nature of a grand jury goes back to making a reference made in the Constitution. So they can exist, but anytime they do exist, they're rigged. And what he said in his report was basically the same thing that Sally Yates said in her ridiculous legal defense to Michael Horowitz, saying you, as the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, cannot look at an ongoing special counsel investigation. You don't have the right. Well, that's not true. Janet Reno changed all these administrative rules concerning special counsels, independent counsels, and then they oftentimes use grand juries.
When you say Janet Reno, as far as we can tell, you might as well say Robert Mueller.
Yeah, exactly. Because this goes way back, way back, and we had pointed out that he set these rules up so long ago that they have been used again and again and again because so few people know them. Now, let me just give you a perfect example. Do you remember when Ashcroft was in the hospital and he needed to sign off on complete surveillance of all Americans again? Because that comes around every once in a while to be signed off on. So Comey and Mueller went to the hospital and said, well, you're in here, you're going to have to sign off on this because we're not, because we don't believe in surveillance. And then they told the whole world this. Remember? They told the whole world with their virtue signaling. They are not, because they're ethical, going to sign off on the surveillance of any Americans. What happened? Ashcroft didn't sign it. They didn't sign it. And because of that, it defaulted and went to continuing 100% surveillance of all Americans. So that's who Comey and Mueller are. They simply, at about the same time, they started this little gig they had where they determined that any law enforcement agent's notes, called 302s, are law. They are considered to be 100% truthful and can be used as evidence in a court case, though in fact they can be written a long time afterwards from their memory, from a one-pointed side point of view. There could be no other witnesses to any of this, and the person that they talked to has no rights, and their version doesn't count.
So that's presuming there that person is 100% truthful all the time, and is therefore making unassailable statements, which is obviously stupid and obviously self-serving. That is the kind of thing that has occurred here with this ruling on grand juries. And what I believe that we have seen here is evidence, hard evidence, that the grand jury system must go, that it is highly illegal. It's claiming to operate outside of the government and we the people, which is ridiculous because the Constitution says all power is vested in the government from we the people. So how can a grand jury be sitting outside of that mechanism in our country? It can't. And yet they're claiming it can, and it appears the reason they get away with it is the only people that really understand this cockamamie language that all these lawyers write is because it's all lawyers who don't speak up and don't protect the rest of us from this gamesmanship that's obviously been going on for maybe forever here. But we're now getting wind of it, and other people, non-lawyers, are starting to read this stuff and say, wait a second, because that's the last thing I want to do as a citizen, is sit and read the convoluted language of lawyers, because now we're learning the longer the document, the more convoluted it is, and the more it's used as an excuse to get away with something. But if I could stick with the investigation into this Williams case a minute, Douglas, let me. We've got to march through this, because what we're seeing here is that the 4 attorneys that the DOJ put up to argue the case in the Supreme Court appear to be the ones who were pressing this agenda to get this flip, which included 4 people: Ken Starr, Robert Mueller, Judge Bryson, who is a FISA was a FISA court judge at the time, or became one, and a guy by the name of Michael Dreeben. And let me just quickly describe the last 2, because those are the 2 probably nobody's heard of. Judge Bryson is a federal circuit judge, and he was on the FISA court during the whole period of the Trump debacle, and therefore has a conflict of interest. And yet he was one of those guys back in 1991 that pushed for this rewriting of the grand jury laws. And the second guy, Dreeben, is a very interesting character, and he's the tie to the Oklahoma City bombing, because he was the chief U.S. prosecutor against Timothy McVeigh during the McVeigh hearings after the bombing. And he is currently a very senior member of the Senior Executive Service. He's on the DOJ 500, so he helps make the decisions along with Bruce Orr for the payment of all the fifth column that we've got called the shadow government, the Senior Executive Service. So Dreeben is on the Mueller Special Counsel Committee and has been, and he was another one of the U.S. attorneys that was arguing the case in 91 for the grand jury to be able to allow exculpatory evidence to be withheld by the special prosecutor. So what we're seeing is all the apple's not falling far from the tree now that we know what we're looking for, and what we're seeing here is an amazing amount of corrupted relationships that are supporting each other, that have now gotten to the point where they are claiming that actions of our government are outside the accountability of we the people or the government itself. This system has to be destroyed immediately, in my opinion.
Absolutely. There's no reason for a grand jury. Now, let's just paint the picture for people who don't understand or don't know what happens in a grand jury, because why would you? Well, first off, if you are on the wrong side of that grand jury, you are already convicted before they begin.
You're hosed.
That's it. You're done. If you're on the good side of the grand jury, like Andrew McCabe, you're going to walk. Matter of fact, because it's secret, and supposedly they're not supposed to leak to the press, we don't know what's happening to Andrew McCabe now. We know that his lack of candor that was found by Michael Horowitz in his investigation, the only person who was in any way politicizing the DOJ and the FBI, was two times that Andrew McCabe had a lack of candor when talking to Michael Horowitz. So they created a grand jury, and they hid it.
You mean this is the same McCabe whose wife took $700,000 from the Clinton Foundation for her campaign? Oh, that person.
That is correct. Also the same
lack
Andrew
of candor.
McCabe,
it's a little bit more than that.
He had 5 investigations on him at the time. 5. So he's going to walk. How do we know that? Because he went to a grand jury indictment. And whoever they impaneled as the judges, that was all set up too. And so, we heard of one witness that came forward in that case so far, James Baker, and we didn't hear what he said. And so that's all we get to know. Oh, but on the other side, when you've got a Mueller grand jury indictment and a special counsel investigation, every single thing that a Republican did in there, in that grand jury indictment, was leaked to the press. Nothing that any of the hundreds of Democrats who were guilty, who were called, who were part of the conspiracy, none of that ever leaked. You'd be shocked if I made the list of who Mueller interrogated and then let go. These are real Russians, the real people who really did this Spygate, Crown Gate, whatever you want to call it, the British, with the help of Ukrainians and Russians and a lot of others, attacking our election and then attacking our president. So what you get there is the following. You go before a grand jury, and they say, you don't get to have your lawyer here. And you say, what?
Right.
Am I in America? Am I in a banana republic? Where am I? They stopped this even in Britain hundreds of years ago because it's uncivil. Why am I being called to a grand jury indictment with a corrupt group of judges that have already decided what they're going to rule? And why don't I get a lawyer? If I'm asked a question and I need legal assistance, I have to get up, go out into the hallway where my lawyer can sit, ask him a question or her a question, and then I can come back in and give it the answer. But now here's what they do. They use wiretaps, and this is what they did on Flynn, what they did on Papadopoulos, what they did on everyone who they get in a process crime for a grand jury indictment, is they already have conversations that they've surveilled. They ask them questions about it. If one single word is wrong, they then say you lied to the grand jury and we're going to put you in jail, or else you have to do everything we say. Now, can you plead the fifth? Recently, Chelsea Manning was locked up again because of a grand jury indictment. Nobody even knows what it's for. She was called before it. She was asked questions about Julian Assange, and what did she say? I plead the fifth. I'm not going to talk about that. And they said, then we're going to lock you up until you do, or until this grand jury indictment is over. Now, a grand jury can be impaneled for years and never come to a conclusion. It happens all the time. Let's remember Dick Cheney. When Dick Cheney put his name up for being the vice president, because he was the head of the search committee and he put his own name in, he was under 5 grand jury indictments at that time because he was working for Halliburton and he was selling to sanctioned countries all kinds of things from Halliburton. And what happened? Nothing. You see? That's what happens in some grand juries. Nothing if you're on the right side. But if you're on the wrong side, and I can tell you from personal experience, friends I know who went to jail for years because of a grand jury indictment, during the entire time they were locked up, they were never guilty. They were not found guilty, but they were locked up during it. They were chiropractors. They had the audacity to practice chiropractic in a state where they decided to set them up and go after them for mail fraud. Imagine a chiropractor for mail fraud because they sent out advertisements. This is what the federal government can do. They can do anything they want. They don't have to let anybody know. They have rules that we don't even know of. For instance, the special counsel gets $100 million a year, open-ended, minimum, and they can do anything they want. Look at Mueller. He thinks that he's outside of the Justice Department. He's outside of Congress. He's outside of the executive. He's outside of the Constitution. He believes this because he actually set up laws that made lawlessness perfectly legal.
Yeah, and they have laid down these corrupt decisions for so many decades. That's why, as an engineer, I look at this and I say, this foundation that they have developed is so darn corrupt. It has to be convoluted by nature because it makes no sense. It's not based on truth, and they've gotten so bad with their precedent setting that they can't even make a good argument anymore. So they're just acting with total like little Nazis in making their decisions. And that's why it's obvious that this grand jury system has to be thrown out. As you point out, there's only 2 places we have it, right? Liberia and the U.S.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So I think that we're there. And what it looks to me like Mueller played his trump card, no pun intended, with citing this U.S. v. Williams case, because when you go actually look at the record, the most telling smoking gun here is that all of the district court records that occurred after the Supreme Court sent it back to the district court are missing. So what are they hiding? Well, what we think they're hiding is all these relationships among these U.S. attorneys where they're using each other at different points of this process to push along this case to the next point. And I'm going to repeat it here again. It looks like those 4 attorneys that argued this with the Supreme Court are the only people in this country who wanted that decision that way. Because what happened after that, Mueller, if we look at the timing of that, that was in 92. And then if we look at Ruby Ridge occurred in 92, Waco occurred in 93, World Trade Center in 93, and Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And this grand jury law was used basically to withhold evidence, and they can do it legally according to that decision. Now, that's assuming that we say that the Supreme Court writes law, which I think is bogus, because what we can say about any legal argument is that it's made for the facts specific to that particular case. It's never intended to be extrapolated to all circumstances that might even be close to that particular set of facts. It's specific to those facts. So we have allowed the Supreme Court to become a writer of laws, and that's what he has cited here. He's cited the Supreme Court Williams case as if it's a law that allows carte blanche the grand jury to have withheld evidence and not invalidate the case, which is what the lower courts in the Williams case all said. It invalidates this because it proves the guy was innocent.
That's the big point. Exculpatory evidence means that the government, in their fake grand jury indictment, has the evidence to show that what they're charging you with is false.
Yes.
But they need a fall guy. They need a scapegoat. So Trump was the scapegoat because it was really Hillary who was guilty. So they could prove that Trump didn't do it by simply showing the exculpatory evidence that Hillary did it, or they could prove. Here's the biggest exculpatory evidence, which was never presented in the Mueller investigation, which he should just be taken out. And treason.
We know what you're thinking.
This is treason. Why didn't he put the joint investigation into Russian meddling, December 2016 report, which cost us, they said there were 500 people working on it and cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. Why didn't they take the second or the third one? Why didn't they take then the fourth one, which was secret? Why didn't they take the Senate Intelligence Committee report when they turned it in after actually interviewing hundreds of people and spending 2 years on it? Why didn't they take the House of Representatives' very complete report? Why didn't they take any of that?
Let me throw in another one.
Because it's exculpatory.
Let me throw in another one that actually implicates Mueller himself. I'm looking at a State Department cable that was written on April 20th of it was in 2009, and it starts out with, "This is an action request for Embassy Moscow regarding the delivery by FBI Director Mueller of a requested sample of seized highly enriched uranium to appropriate Russian authorities." You talk about Russian meddling, that's Russian meddling.
It is illegal.
And he didn't bring that up. So Trump is exactly right. The guy's conflicted. He should never have even stepped close to this case.
He is illegally carrying enriched uranium underneath the auspices of diplomatic immunity, and it was Putin himself who named Mueller as the person who was the only person he would receive that yellow cake uranium from. And remember, this was supposedly intercepted in Georgia. More. That's all a lie. It was made right here in America.
FBI Mueller's trip to Moscow on April 27th of 2009 provides an opportunity to deliver the requested 10 grams from the seized HEU in order to obtain cooperation from the GOR on this nuclear smuggling case and to eventually establish a more productive mechanism of U.S.-Russian cooperation on nuclear forensics. So they couched it all in terms of some smuggling case. But the point is, Mueller was there in Moscow on the tarmac with uranium. At the same time, we now know Bill and Hillary were cutting uranium deals with Putin. None of that came out. Why? Because the Williams case allows him to withhold that evidence and not disqualify the underlying grand jury indictment. Outrageous.
Isn't that sweet? And the enriched uranium was transported via an airplane and airplane twice.
An FBI jet.
Which is illegal. Which is illegal in all terms. All terms. American, Russian, international, doesn't matter. That can't happen. What was that yellow cake? That was to demonstrate to Putin that the Uranium One deal, getting our uranium from Wyoming and him getting 20% through Rosatom and
Yep, Rosatom's mentioned in this cable, by the way.
Which is directly run by Putin himself. He handles all uranium in both Kazakhstan and in Russia. That's a fact. Every single deal is a Putin deal. And he'll tell you that. He said this many, many times publicly. So what were they doing? They were taking, because he didn't trust that the Paducah, Kentucky enrichment facility would be effective anymore, because Putin had already worn it out. That's going to cost us about $4 billion to clean up and to basically close the Paducah plant. Also, the Portsmouth plant had been used up in the Russian megatons for megawatts deal, which was taking uranium from missiles in Russia, downgrading them, bringing them to America, enriching them in our facilities, and then giving the profit to Putin as he sells it to our own nuclear facilities here in America. Now, that's
okay.
what...
Can I stop you? Because what you're describing is what actually happened. But the point here, isn't it the point that Mueller specifically withheld this evidence, which would have been exculpatory for our president, and he used the Williams case to achieve that objective?
Yes.
And he cited it in his own document.
And as a lawyer, they put gag orders on everybody. William Douglas Campbell, the person who was involved in all of this, who has testified and put the head of the Russian company, Rosatom's group here in America, put him in jail. And so William Douglas Campbell has a gag order on him. You see, because Mueller is an expert at putting gag orders on people because they don't want the exculpatory evidence to ever be talked about.
I just had a thought. It just came to me now. This Michael Dreeben, who prosecuted McVeigh, was the staff member for. He's one of the staff in the Mueller investigation now. Now we know he's a member of the DOJ 500, so he is making the decisions on compensation for the entire stay-behind 10,000 SES Army. Why did Mueller put Dreeben specifically on the special counsel case if it wasn't for any other reason than it was a message to the entire SES community to keep your mouth shut?
As well as Dreeben is an expert in hiding exculpatory evidence, just like Jeannie Ray was basically a Clinton Foundation member and Hillary's best buddy, just like Andrew Weissman worked directly for the Department of Justice and was one of the first people to receive the Christopher Steele dossier, along with Zainab Ahmad, who we are told that the other SES member of the 500, Bruce Orr, he's not fired yet, by the way, but he was a back channel, but he back-channeled it from criminals who were receiving it from Russians, because remember, Christopher Steele was fired by the FBI, and yet still for 3 more times they signed the FISA warrant saying, oh no, we swear that everything on here is true, but we had to fire the guy we got all the information from and the dossier. And so the dossier is not mentioned by Mueller.
That is so against the rules of evidence as I know it. Once you have proved that a person is lying, all their evidence must be thrown out.
Well, then you'd have to throw out Comey and all his evidence, because remember, he's probably the first person who testified, and we know that Mueller met with him before Comey testified before Congress after he leaked all the information and was proud of it and told everybody that he'd committed this federal crime. So
right, it's called impeachment. That once you've impeached your testimony, you're impeached as a witness. You can't say, okay, I'm now telling the truth. If you've lied and it's proven, You can't come back and say, well, I'm going to tell the truth here, folks, so listen to me here.
That's why Michael Cohen testifying before the Congress was insane. They had already charged him with the crimes of lying before Congress, so why would they ask him more questions? And then What did he say in his opening statement?
Because it's all big theater, isn't it,
Douglas?
Yeah. It's all theater, propaganda's all lies.
He said in his opening statement,
and that's what we've got here.
I have lied, but I'm not a liar. I mean, hello. Okay, right. Sit down, because that's a lie. Get him out of here. Okay, so what we have here is the exculpatory evidence for Trump, for the Mueller investigation. We know previously that the FBI already did the most comprehensive background check on Trump and his father, and they published it. That wasn't included. How come none of the things that cleared Trump were ever included in this report, but all of the innuendos are? And now,
Douglas, we're showing a conspiracy to create the very precedent case that they're trying to rely upon to get out of jail for lying and for withholding evidence. We're showing a conspiracy here that goes back to 91, 92, actually to 88 when the Williams case started. The other thing I need to mention is the original associate U.S. attorney on the Williams matter was the brother of the bank that accused his client of fraud, and that was a guy named Frank Keating, who ended up being governor of Oklahoma during the Oklahoma City bombing. When Dreeben, it was another guy who was taking the case out in Colorado, who was Dreeben's staff assistant. So it's all very incestuous.
Let's remember that Mueller was in charge at the time of the FBI at the time of 9/11. He knows how to hide evidence better than anybody you can shake a stick at. No one is better than him. And the team that he pulled together, including people who were connected to the British, very deeply connected to the British. We could go into that, but the point is the people on his team. Yes, they are so corrupt and so crooked. You couldn't get experts in those areas. Who is Andrew Weissman? He's the guy who kicks down the doors and steals the evidence, takes it back and says, "Oops, we took too much. We actually got your privileged information between you and your counsel, you and your attorney. Oh, but we're going to return it now. And by the way, we didn't look at it while we had it." He did that. He did that to Cohen. He did it to Manafort. He did it to Trump. They went in, Trump transition team, all of his materials, they went in and stole.
Well, Douglas, you know what we're looking at here? We're looking at a government that's been hijacked by these crooked attorneys. That's what we're looking at.
Oh,
let's bottom line this.
Absolutely. Because what they really did was, remember this, people, when you think about Mueller, do not forget this. Who was it that went and applied for the job of the FBI after being the head of the FBI for 10 years and then getting a 2-year extension, which I don't think that's ever happened before? So for 12 years, Robert Mueller covered up 9/11 and made sure that the White House criminals did not get caught for any crimes. Mind you, in that time, he put only really, really, really obvious criminals in jails. Like, the only thing that he can actually say he did is going after crime bosses. Well, everybody knew they were crime bosses. How can you not arrest them? I mean, anybody.
Well,
he did
incarcerate without a trial a Linda. What was her last name? A CIA whistleblower who said that there was plenty of indications before 9/11 that they were going to try some sort of attack. And she was Susan Landauer, I think was her name. And she was incarcerated without trial for, I think, a little bit less than 2 years.
There's been numerous cases directly associated with Mueller while he was in Massachusetts where he put people in jail that he knew did not commit the crime, and he had the evidence to show who did and that those people were innocent, and yet he still, to this very day, will not go back and change those.
Well, they use the powers of the government to suppress all truth tellers. That's what we're seeing here. This isn't the government we want, but this is the government we've got. So we've got to change this.
Yes, we do. Now, when Mueller went to interview to be the new FBI director after Comey was fired, think of that. This is a man who gets paid $100 million a year working for HSBC, or Melon Optima. His returns are, I forget what they are, tens of millions each year, and he didn't even have the money to buy into it. He's just their lawyer. This is a man who makes more money than you can shake a stick at, who is going to then become the FBI director for another 10-year term? No. He wanted to be the FBI director after Comey was fired because he had to cover his own crimes. Not only Uranium One, but all these other things that we're talking about. And only he knows these rules because only people like him have ever used them.
Wait. What we're looking at here is not only the Department of Justice and its FBI, but also the judiciary is in on this. So what we're looking at is the highest level of corruption you can imagine, that I am sure the fish starts rotting from the head. And therefore what we're looking at is a completely corrupted judiciary and Department of Justice and FBI, and that these guys know that it's so corrupt they can get away with whatever they want. If this isn't proof that we have got to completely remake those agencies, I don't know how you could get more clear.
Well, you're right. It comes from the top. Who plucked out the judge for Imran Awan and put Chutkan in, the new judge? Who didn't recuse Judge Leon, who literally teaches a course with John Podesta, as John Podesta is being charged with, by the way, nothing has happened in that case. The $12 million they paid Perkins Coie to pay Fusion, which created the dossier, that should put Podesta and Hillary in jail. No, that case isn't going forward because Judge Leon is literally best buddies with John Podesta, but he didn't get recused. But what we see is anytime the case is going the wrong direction, they'll pluck that judge out and put another judge in. But the big corruption, if you don't believe what I'm saying, think about this. We know that the Inspector General's audit of the FISA court showed that they were in 100% non-compliance, both internationally and domestic. 100%. Literally, hundreds of millions of people in the downline were being surveilled. In other words, every single American was being surveilled under the auspices of international warrants, which were invalid. They were bogus. And then we know that the FBI under Comey didn't pull down a single FISA warrant except for Carter Page. One, and one only, and it was corrupt. It was renewed 4 times, and the 3 times it was renewed, it was under horrible corruption because Christopher Steele had already been fired by the FBI. But that's not the issue. The issue is there was no hearing on any of those. It's a trick. It's a lawyer trick. It was an insurance policy. They didn't need that.
It was a policy decision to allow the Attorney General to make those decisions without any other consultation.
Yep. And then they used national security letters to actually get the warrants for the wiretapping. And they used Robert Hannigan, at which they denied recently, and the General Communications Headquarters of Britain to spy as a Five Eyes member through Fort Meade, Maryland on Trump at Trump Towers. That's a fact, folks. So I don't know why anybody even debates that anymore. This has come out repeatedly by the people who were involved. So what we're looking at is the FISA court should have been closed. There was a point when they were asking the question, because of the abuse of the 702s, these FISA warrants, whether it should be closed altogether. It should be. It absolutely should be. There's no reason whatsoever.
The only oversight is John Roberts, the Chief Justice, and it's clear he's not doing anything. He's asleep at the wheel.
And we know these FISA court judges are as corrupt as anyone. Judge Contreras, a friend of Peter Strzok, sat on the grand jury and for the entire case and only recused himself before they made a judgment on what the sentencing would be. Unbelievable. And yet they never brought before Judge Contreras the very FISA court warrant that the entire thing was based upon. They never brought the dossier which it was based upon. They never told, Judge Contreras was never told that it was the Hillary and Podesta who paid for it. They were never told it was fake. They were never told. Not a bit of it was ever verified. And yet at the bottom, when they put their name on it, Sally Yates, Dana Bante, Comey, Rosenstein, and a couple others, when they signed that FISA court warrant, they swore that everything in it was true. Now, we have the testimony of Rod Rosenstein where he was questioned by Jim Jordan, and he literally admitted He signed the document without reading it. And when Jordan said, "What are you talking about?"
Do you believe that? I don't.
He said, "What are you talking about?" Rosenstein got angry. Good old rat Rosenstein, who's now resigning so he doesn't have to answer any more questions while he can still be under oath and can't plead the fifth because it's part of his job. He's getting out. He had to stay for a minute, to make the smooth transition with the Mueller Caca dossier, which is what I call Mueller's special investigation. He stayed for a minute, but what he really was doing was he knew all along. He has been a friend of Mueller's and Comey's since back to the 70s. If you think for one second...
Well, clearly these guys all knew about these loopholes in the grand jury. None of these guys told us, we the people, that these loopholes existed, and yet now they're trying to save their butts by citing them. We've got to do something. We cannot just see this happening and do nothing. So the question is who? Because the courts aren't going to do anything about this.
Well,
they're in on it.
The globalists have their seat in Britain and in the Vatican, and they have their own rules, their own courts, and they can do whatever they want. Here in America, they had to be much sneakier about it. So what they did is they created a grand jury, which isn't even allowed in the evil United Kingdom, okay? But it's allowed here because when you go to a grand jury, the tables are turned. And for instance, let's take Trump. The House Intelligence Committee, the House Judiciary Committee has already said he's guilty without ever seeing any evidence. Okay? So guilty before proven innocent. Matter of fact, he's guilty and you can't prove him innocent. But you take an Andrew McKibben, he's innocent before he's ever even tried. So the rules of, you're innocent to begin with,
till proven guilty.
Till proven guilty is no longer working here because that isn't the way it works with the globalists. That isn't the way it works with the monarchy. That isn't the way it works with the senior executive service members, the shadow government,
right.
The bureaucratic status quo, what they used to call the establishment, but they, a very vague term. Now, we can name the people who are part of this, and they do have a chance, like a Bruce Orr or a Michael Dreeben. They have a chance. They need to resign and leave, just like James Baker and John Carlin and Jonathan Weiner and all the other guilty people. Every one of those people who left in a big hussy and a fury and with a furor, like Jonathan Weiner, who came out with 3 conversations he had on TV where he spilled the beans on Hillary, and basically that was his alibi. Okay, so we got the alibi of Andrew McCabe's book, we got Comey's alibi, we got Donna Brazil's alibi, we got Stephen Rowe's alibi. We have so many alibis because everyone who gives their alibi is guilty. Did Trump give an alibi? You don't need to give an alibi if you didn't do anything wrong. So, innocent till proven guilty?
Well, that's just for propaganda.
Yeah. Innocent.
The alibi is just to be cited for propaganda. It's fake evidence.
But it's what they call getting out ahead of the narrative with the spin
right.
and getting that tail to wag the dog. And that's what
right.
Clapper's
done. If they
keep
repeating the lie long enough, then most people who don't pay much attention will give them the benefit of the doubt, and then they'll move on. So what we've got to do is we've got to change this up. The question is what? We've now identified what's going on and the facts to prove it. Now, what's got to happen in order to get rid of the grand jury, to get rid of the SCS, and get rid of all these attorneys in Washington who have completely corrupted our republic?
Federal courts should only exist in the District of Columbia, nowhere else. And there is almost nothing that the federal court does that can't be done by state courts. Federal courts were a battle in the early days of America to try to get state judicial power over another state. And that's what it's all about. They don't need to be there. They all need to go back to D.C. and only handle federal issues, and that's only when we, the states, decide that we're not handling them. For instance, we can solve so many of these problems, but fake justice, lawfare, this Department of Injustice, these law enforcement agents who are only enforcing lawlessness, this has to stop. And this is what Trump is fighting right now. This is the coup against America. This is not against Trump. This is not against Trump. This is against our
Correct.
Constitution. This is using a grand jury and special counsels to overthrow a duly elected president. This is a George Soros regime, color revolution takeover coup, whatever you want to call it. But the point is, they use lawfare. They use the trickery of the justice system, the fake justice system. And because Mueller, Comey, Rosenstein, Christopher Wray, so many of them who go back and forth between the Department of Justice and the FBI and sometimes the CIA, oftentimes, these are criminals.
And then they give their buddies judgeships so they can get what they want whenever they need to have a judge say something. Yeah, it's completely rigged. We've proven it now, and Mueller cited this rigging in his defense.
Which shows his hubris, his audacity, and his clear intent to not follow the law, but in fact to manipulate the law, and even then to manipulate it and hide it in federal rules, regulations, court proceedings, these aren't even laws. These aren't even laws. These are simply regulations that aren't approved by Congress. So because grand jury is mentioned in the Constitution, what a grand jury is and what it does and what its powers are not defined. So I say, throw out the grand jury. Forget the grand jury. Think of any time there's ever been an independent counsel or a special counsel or a grand jury where you saw justice happen. No. That's like saying, was the 911 commission true?
Well, it's
No.
obvious why. They're allowed to withhold evidence. So how are you ever going to get justice in a situation like that? You're never going to get justice in a situation like that.
Well, let's just look at this. One little teensy tiny thing. Mueller watched Tower 7 collapse, the only steel-framed building in history that ever collapsed from fires. And then he watched when the other two towers fell. What did he do? He sequestered them and made it a crime for anyone to take a single speck of the building debris. Remember this?
Yep.
It was...
Well, it's because they'd find the explosives that were used to pancake the building.
Thermite was found. There was a lady whose husband died in the tower attack by Cheney. This is a Bush-Cheney attack with Rumsfeld. This is with the Brits helped, also the Israelis helped, also the Pakistan. Lots of people helped in this, but it had to do with huge amounts of money that the Vulcans had basically invented out of thin air and then needed to bring back into our system. But that's neither here nor there. The point is there's no truth whatsoever. But if we simply take that lady took a bucket of the debris, it was sent to the major people in universities who had to do with blowing up buildings. What do you call it?
Explosives.
Yes, and they found... Demolition of buildings. And what did they find, 100% of them? Thermite. Weapons-grade, military-grade thermite. That's the reason the fire burnt so long. That can't happen from fuel from a plane. It was thermite. Thermite is used in controlled demolitions to bring these buildings down. It was found in massive quantities. Now, go ahead and ask the question.
Steel does not disappear into powder from a regular fire.
Thank you. And what did they do? They quickly loaded it up on barges and said that they sent it to China. Later, they said that they sent it down to New Orleans and built a ship out of it and named it after somebody. Later, they said that they don't know where it went. So basically, that is what Robert Mueller did with the evidence of 911. He made sure that nobody ever got it, except for one lady. And then that evidence showed that he kept the exculpatory evidence showing that it was a controlled demolition. He needs to go far beyond jail.
Well, they did get the Patriot Act out of it, Douglas. So there's some good for him.
And remember that John Brennan had just joined the CIA, and he was the first person ever to be part of the Islamic counterterrorism unit, where he then degraded the Islamic radical Islamic fascism and terrorism to being no, that isn't what the Muslims believe, and he changed all the books on that. And he was, in fact, turned to being a Muslim when he was at Riyadh. And remember, Riyadh was also blown up. And then remember, he was appointed to that job literally weeks before 9/11. And then what happened? Yep. 9/11 happened, and then he and Mueller, 1 week afterwards, decided that there would be no investigations to any of the things that were in the 911 buildings in the Twin Towers, as the new FBI headquarters had been put there with all the evidence concerning all these different cases, and it was all destroyed just like in the Oklahoma bombing. And, Mueller made sure that none of that was ever brought up. None of the fact of the Brady bonds were brought up. None of the facts of where the supposed planes hit were brought up. We can give you 10,000 pieces of incongruent information and evidence that he did not look at, and the 911 Commission was nothing but a sham. And even the 28 pages that said, yes, the Saudi Arabian intelligence agents were connected to this bombing, and that they were the ones who issued most of the visas directly out of the palace of King Saud, which James Baker the third or the second, or the old James Baker, went over there and set up that office months before 9/11. We have so much evidence. What did you do, Mueller? Where were you? Why did none of this evidence ever come to the surface? Why did you bury it?
Because they were using 9/11 to scare the American public into giving up all of their rights to their communication so that they could further consolidate power around their digital empire. That was their plan, and the deaths at 9/11 were collateral damage to them. These are eugenicists. They don't care about human beings, and they're using these machinations of the law to hide their activity and hoping none of us would ever ask questions.
And as you pointed out, the U.S. Patriot Act, which was immediately created, it had already been.
Yeah, isn't that magical that it was already written, ready to go?
Well, then they immediately enforced it, and what did it say? It says we are in a war every day of our life since 9/11, and it's not just radical Islamic fascist terrorists. No. Every single American is considered a terrorist until proven otherwise. That's what the U.S.
That's how they got
Act
around
says.
the prescriptions in the Constitution not to surveil on Americans.
That's why.
And but by the way, I'll point out September 11th, 2001. By November 28th, 29th, the IBM Eclipse Foundation was created, and the distribution of the our social networking invention occurred, and that then. They had to wait for us to get finished. So by early 2004, it was in wide distribution, and it was intended as a surveillance platform and a way to make money, to further finance their activities. And look how far they've gotten today.
They've gotten so far that Mueller got some of the certification crypto keys himself. He forced them out of the hands of Hillary herself.
Called Cloudflare, by the way, Cloudflare. And it's being used by the election systems in a number of states. So this is going to be the new man in the middle for the next election, these encryption keys.
And so Mueller is in at the highest level with HSBC, with Lockheed, with Mellon Optima, with Bridgewater, with every corrupt group he works for. Okay? And when you want to talk about offshore accounts, with Manafort, if you found the offshore accounts of that guy, of Mueller, you would be shocked. You would be shocked. I doubt you can find all of them, because he's been being paid off since the time that they appointed him the head of the FBI to cover 9/11, because they knew that he'd covered everything else, because he's the perfect person to create the new laws or the new regulations that make sure that the federal government doesn't have to allow evidence of any sort to be presented, and they can, in fact, invent evidence, 302 reports or anything they want, and that evidence stands, but the real exculpatory evidence that would prove the person innocent is not allowed. And this is what has happened in the Mueller investigation, and this was the big reveal for today, that Mueller has, over decades, prepared these loopholes so that he could get people out of trouble so that then later he can charge them and they'll make direct deposits to his offshore account. That's the way that it works. And if you think otherwise, then just go look at what he did with Melanoptima. Go look at what he did with HSBC. Go look at what he and Comey. Follow the biography of Comey and Mueller, which we have in our intelligence reports, and you will see these two have been working in tandem, and they go in and out in a revolving door between corporations and high positions in the government to deregulate, to change laws so that unlawfulness is allowed, both on the corporate and on the personal level. And then Michael Horowitz comes along, and his main job was to teach corporations how to get out of getting in trouble and to teach judges to give easy plea deals as well as easy sentences to corporations, but to use this system we're describing to go after anybody who's their enemy.
Right. So, by the way, we will point out that one of the pieces of evidence that he failed to cite in his report was the Allison Saunders dinner with the Orrs 4 days before the Trump Tower meeting. Isn't that amazing that he left that important item of evidence out, which was then finally given to the Department, that the Department of Justice finally gave to Judicial Watch, who had been asking for this information for years, and they finally gave it a couple of weeks ago. So that, of all the evidence, shows you that he is relying on the Williams case to withhold evidence that would show that somebody's innocent and that would show President Trump is innocent, and has been.
That's right. How could Mueller ignore the Attorney General, the Crown Prosecutor of Britain, sneaking over here?
Chief Crown Prosecutor.
Chief Crown Prosecutor, basically the Queen's attorney, came over, dinner with Orrs, both of whom were back channels to the FBI after Christopher Steele had been fired, not only for the mishandling of the dossier, but because it's all salacious and never was verified and is complete nonsense. And yet, this is the hugest thing ever. How could he ignore it? Because he just simply says, no, we're not going to allow that evidence that would show Hillary's guilt. We're just simply going to do what we did with 9/11, what we did with Waco. And let's remember, one of the things that happened at Waco is 4 of the bodyguards of Hillary Clinton were shot in the back of the head. Isn't that amazing?
And one was killed at the Oklahoma City bombing.
Isn't that incredible?
Mm-hmm.
What a surprise. And now it's Hillary and all the dead bodies that were part of the Russian meddling, and I mean there are dead bodies, all back to Hillary again. And yet none of that evidence will be looked at. They will. It's like this. Head of the Department of Justice, if you can't charge George Soros with tax evasion, you're fired. If you can't say that the 911 report was false, you're fired. Because any 5th grader could understand these things and do something about it. And yet, what do? No, it's protection of the old boys club.
Well, how afraid do you think these people are of Michael Dreeben since he's making decisions on their money? Somehow we've got to break that cycle, that SES cycle.
Yeah, especially Bruce Orr is still making decisions on who gets the presidential awards when he should be in jail for treason. The back channel for Christopher Steele after he was fired by the FBI, who supposedly didn't turn any of this stuff over to his superiors. Unbelievable. It is unbelievable because it's a lie. Sally Yates was certainly complicit, and certainly Bruce Orr did turn it over to Sally Yates. That, and as well as Loretta Lynch, as well as everyone else in the Justice Department. It was a big party over there. It was like a conspiracy party. How much happier could they possibly be? I mean, it was, they said when you went into John Brennan's office, it looked like the headquarters for Hillary Clinton's campaign. Okay, as well as it has a prayer rug on the floor so he can do his radical Islamic, fascist, terrorist prayers 5 times a day. Isn't that incredible? And yet we're not going to look into whether or not he was radicalized when he was in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh was blown up. No, we're not going to look into any of that. But Michael, as always, with everything from the dinner with the Orrs to what it is you're bringing today in terms of the exculpatory evidence that is not allowed in the Mueller investigation, it's always a revelation to talk with you. So we're going to sign off now. But let's chat again soon. And next time, let's chat about someone I really think we need to talk more about, Arvinder Sambai. So thank you, Michael.
You're welcome, and say hi to Betsy.
Certainly will.